Hello, everyone. My name is Liz Herkey, and I'm the board chair of the Animals and Society Institute. On behalf of the board and staff, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's celebration of 40 years of the Animals and Society Institute. We have a wonderful program for today, and I want to start by thanking our speakers, Erica Fudge and Zane McNeill, who have generously donated their time to be here today, and we thank you both. Before Erica and Zane speak today, we're going to hear from Gala Argent, ASI's Human Animal Studies Program Director, and Susan McHugh, Editor-in-Chief of our managed journal, Society and Animals, published by Brill. Without giving anything away, Gala and Susan are going to share some of their journey into the HAS field. This left me thinking that I should probably explain something about how I got here, but the truth is I'm still not quite sure, which is only half facetious. Most of the time, you'll find me working as a clinical health and medical psychologist. Of course, my husband would say that most of the time you'll simply find me working, and that's probably fair. And in some ways, it's a funny thing because I'm an HAS scholar, but that's really it. ASI and the field of human animal studies attract all kinds of people with all kinds of skills and interests. What we have in common is we are curious and care about our relationship with other species, and how fortunate and how needed this is. So when we think about all who have contributed to ASI's success, we are being very grateful for a wide range of people: academics, scholars, teachers, activists, editors, copy editors, editors-in-chief, reviewers, our publishing partners, and other professionals who all dedicate time and expertise to the journals, policy papers, colloquium series, and the treasure trove of faculty and student resources, to name just some of what ASI offers. Also grateful to the hundreds of clinicians who have cared enough to be trained in our animal abuse prevention psychoeducation programs. I would be remiss if I didn't include all the board members, volunteers, and terrific staff, past and present, who work tirelessly behind the scenes. We are incredibly grateful to our loyal and generous financial supporters, including our legacy donors, individual and major gift donors, monthly donors, and foundation supporters. In fact, none of ASI's work would be possible without all of you. We thank you all, including all of you here today, for your curiosity and your caring. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce Ken Shapiro, one of the co-founders of ASI and the current board president. Ken will get us started with how it all got started. Ken?
Thank you, Liz, and thanks to you all for celebrating this 40th anniversary with us and for your support of Animals and Society Institute over the years. 40 years, really? Why it seems like just yesterday. Actually, it also feels like a long, long road full of twists and turns and ups and downs, and I am grateful for being on that continuing journey. Liz and I begin with a history of ASI, but first I want to share a memory which, like many origin stories, may be a bit apocryphal. As is its custom, the winter in Maine had extended itself well into the March of 1981, and up to the very day of the modest Animal Protection Conference I had organized at Bates College, where I was a faculty member in the psych department. It was probably one of the first such campus events in the US. Tom Reagan, author of the not yet seminal Ethical Theory of Animal Rights, was the featured speaker. The winter storm had canceled all flights to Maine, so Tom and a friend of mine from my graduate days at Duke drove up literally through the night to get to the conference. 14 people showed up for the event, including the several speakers and the two guys who shoveled a path to the hall. This was the launch of Psychologists for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. So SIETA, the predecessor organization of ASI, and ASI have come a long way since that inauspicious beginning over 40 years ago. And we are gratified to see so many of you in attendance in this celebratory moment. The animal protection movement also has come a long way. The development of ASI mirrors those changes and can proudly take some credit for initiating them. At first, the movement was mostly local groups in the streets with their banners and signs. The leader of a protest in front of the Department of Agriculture in the National Mall bullhorned out, "What do we want?" Animal rights. When do we want it? Now. Passers-by were at first indifferent, then bemused, then irritated, even hostile. But then some became curious, and some were moved with a shock of recognition. Yes, there are problems with our treatment of animals. Yes, I need to know more. As the grassroots moved, Congress and the courts of justice, the need to know more became more critical. Enter ASI. ASI took on the knowing more. Our mission statement is advancing and sharing knowledge to improve non-human animal lives. ASI is an international think tank that provides resources to researchers and educators, as well as to grassroots and national animal protection organizations. As an interdisciplinary field envisioned to provide evidence-based information for the movement and to educate the public, human animal studies has enjoyed amazing growth in its 3 decades, with dozens of journals, book series, courses, majors, degree programs, dedicated chairs, dedicated conferences, and occasional t-shirts. ASI took a leading role in the field's development through a wide range of initiatives. Society in Animals, the Journal of Human Animal Studies, now in its 30th year and producing 8 issues per year. The Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science, now in its 28th year and receiving over 140,000 article downloads annually, 140,000. Sloth, a journal for undergraduates and early career scholars that is being relaunched as we speak. The Animal History Journal, sponsored by ASI, publishing its inaugural issue in 2025. We have also developed summer institutes for graduate students pursuing doctorate and master's theses in human animal studies. We will continue the popular Defining Human Animal Studies video project, now in its 3rd year. ASI is built on 4 distinct but also overlapping pillars: research, education, policy, and global reach. Human Animal Studies speaks directly to 2 of these pillars, research and education. But it also provides theory and data in support of progressive policy involving animals. And in terms of global reach, in 2023, authors of S&A came from 56 countries, and from JAWS, 45 countries. Through our International Development Program, we continue to support universities in several countries outside of the United States as they develop curriculum and programs in human animal studies. As its name suggests, the Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science is devoted to the application pillar. Whether in the home, the farm, the lab, the zoo, or the wild, animals have a right to life and a right to a quality of life consistent with their natural capabilities. The articles published in JAWS document the suffering and exploitation of our practices involving animals. They also expose the inconsistencies, species-based discrimination of current policies and practices. They include recommendations for changes that would improve the lives of the animals involved. Beyond these welfare measures, they demonstrate that some practices are unsustainable and must be abolished. Animals simply cannot thrive in those conditions. An example of this is the evidence that elephants cannot be elephants in any real sense in a traditional zoo setting. ASI policy papers draw on these publications and the now dozen or so other journals on animal issues to produce papers that make the case for more progressive practices involving non-human animals and humans alike. ASI's policy papers present a wide contextualized discussion that includes relevant science, history, and cultural factors, as well as existing law, policy, and practice. At this point, it's my honor to turn to Liz for the rest of this brief history. In addition to chairing the board, Liz has played an indispensable role for the past year as acting director of ASI. Liz, up to you.
Thank you, Ken. Another major program area for ASI involves what is called the link. This research establishes what is really intuitively obvious, that animal abuse, human violence, and other antisocial behaviors co-occur. Bad acts generalize both within and critical to our mission across species lines. Based on this established cross-species relationship, numerous policies have been enacted. Felony-level animal abuse laws in all 50 states, protective orders that include companion animals in 40 states, and 272 domestic violence shelters that now accommodate companion animals, as well as the target of intimate human violence. However, for various reasons, including crowded courts and prisons and failure to recognize the link, the number of prosecutions of animal abuse cases remains low. In response, ASI has developed the ANACARE approach, a set of interventions that can supplement, or in cases of relatively minor abuse, replace jail time for those convicted of animal abuse. These psychotherapeutic and psychoeducational interventions incentivize the criminal justice and court systems to take on more of these cases. ANACARE also provides assessment tools that can distinguish between those likely to be helped through an intervention and those for whom jail time is a necessary deterrent. BARK, a third intervention we are currently refining, is a less intensive psychoeducational diversion program intended for offenders whose animal abuse is considered less egregious. Through a generous grant, an asynchronous version of BARK will be available in early 2025. This virtual self-directed format will allow us to gather data on the efficacy of this intervention, establishing that it is evidence-based. The program will be directed by Kate Nickel, founder and director of Soul Friends Incorporated, and in partnership with the newly created Center for Veterinary Social Work at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. As we did recently in Michigan, ASI also provides expert testimony for states that seek to upgrade animal abuse legislation, making incarceration levels for felony-level animal abuse a more effective deterrent. Built on research on the link, the ANACARE program's major impact is on policy and educating the various stakeholders related to domestic animal abuse. Taken together, evidence of the link and the many policy and practice innovations based on it send a powerful message. Animals are worthy of respect. We need to enact more progressive policies and practices involving them. In addition to and complementing the 4 pillars, ASI is striving to make diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging be fundamental to all we do and how we do it. Internally, ASI will increasingly address the relative lack of ethnic diversity that has been a perennial challenge for both the animal protection movement and its academic and social service arms. Funded by a generous grant from Springpoint Partners, the ASI board and staff partnered with consultants to conduct an internal DEI audit in 2023, the idea being that we must first look inward before we look out. With this education, ASI is in a stronger position to embody these issues programmatically. In terms of underrepresented populations, we will be working to identify and encourage such students and scholars to contribute to our journals and other publications as authors, editors, and reviewers. For example, our most recent monograph in the Brill Human Animal Studies book series is subtitled Human-Animal Relations in the Amazon, Andes, and Arctic. This anthology is an important contribution to the recent interest in Indigenous studies and neo-animism, and features studies of how the worldviews of Indigenous peoples influence their relationships to other animals. We are also negotiating with Brill, the publisher of Society and Animals, as well as our book series, to edit a volume in their Perspective Research series. It will consist of articles by students and scholars from the Global South, which is currently underrepresented in the human-animal studies field. This year, we've begun reaching out to faculty and other contacts at historically Black colleges and universities. We also will continue to encourage and facilitate the involvement of students and early career scholars through our popular colloquium series, produced in partnership with the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. To conclude, ASI has been very busy these past 40 years, and we are poised and ready to take on the ever more revealing and nuanced forms of animal exploitation that lie ahead. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gala Argent. Dr. Argent is an interdisciplinary educator and scholar and a lifelong horsekeeper whose work concerns theorizing the intersubjectivity of communication and relationships between humans and horses. Her most recent publication is the co-edited anthology, The Relational Horse: How Frameworks of Communication, Care, Politics, and Power Reveal and Conceal Equine Selves. Gala is Human Animal Studies Program Director at ASI, where she promotes and forwards the field of human animal studies. Gala? Gala, you're on mute.
That helps. Thank you, Liz. I'm honored and delighted to be here. And it's always fun to reflect on positive experiences in one's life. And I share this one because the way it ends reflects the experiences of many here today. The year was 2007. I was at a small conference on other animals in Russian culture and history. A little background. I was beginning to write up my PhD dissertation in interpretive archaeology as a mature student. I'd finished my fieldwork on an Iron Age community in Russia, which buried its dead with sacrificed riding horses. At that time, archaeological thought considered animals in human graves as grave goods or material culture, as objects no more important than a pot or a arrowhead. And this didn't jibe with my experience of the intersubjectivity and interpersonality of living with horses as I did. And I wanted to somehow bring that to the table. I believed these horses deserved more, that all horses deserve more. I was, however, stuck because I hadn't been able to find any theory or method to bring human-horse relationships into the mix. And obviously, I couldn't just say, I know this because I've lived it. So I was excited to be at this conference, and I hoped to glean some fresh ideas. But as things progressed, it became clear that the focus was not on the mutuality of interspecies relationships I was interested in, but rather on human representations and constructions of animals. Now, this is in no way to disparage that type of work. It's important, but it's rather to say that it wasn't how I wanted my work to go. So despite that letdown, a wonderful thing happened at that conference. Animal studies scholar Nigel Rothfels pulled me aside and gave me a tip. Look into the Animals in Society Institute. That was really life-changing. Through ASI, I found the field of human animal studies. Through Ken Shapiro and others' work, I found theory and method to hang my hat on. It gave me courage to move beyond what was being done and had been done for much too long. I could pull horses themselves as subjects into my work. I could write them into archaeological thinking. As an HAS scholar, I was able to make positive changes to how animals are viewed in archaeology, and more broadly, to send out positive reverberations on butterfly wings that I hope have bettered the lives of horses. But perhaps equally more important, I found I wasn't alone. There were others who got it in the way I did. I fit somewhere. And here, and I'm confident of this, that mine is but one of many stories that go like this. The Animals in Society Institute changed both my intellectual and life trajectories. ASI changes both human and animal lives. And I think all of you here today are proof of that. All of which is to say that my life would have been much more boring and monumentally less fulfilling without ASI. So thank you, ASI. Thank you, board members who donate your time. Thank you, Liz Herkey and Ivy Collier, for being wonderful executive directors. Thank you, Ken Shapiro, for being a wonderful mentor. And cheers to another great 40 years. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Susan McHugh, who is professor of English at the University of New England, USA. Susan researches and teaches literary, visual, and scientific narratives of cross-species relations. She is the author of 3 monographs, most recently Love in the Time of Slaughters, Human Animal Stories Against Genocide and Extinction, published in 2019 by Penn State University Press. She has co-edited 8 academic volumes, including Animal Satire in 2023, and she serves as editor-in-chief of ASI's interdisciplinary academic journal, Society and Animals. Susan.
Thank you, Gayla, for that very kind introduction. And wow, I'm looking around here, seeing so many friends, seeing people from all over the world. Thank you all for being here today. I have a few words to share too, along the lines of what Gala just shared, about just to provide a little more context to today's celebrations. Way back at the millennial turn, when I was a PhD student, I completed a PhD on animals and literature. Non-human life was considered generally off topic in the arts and humanities, except as symbols or stand-ins for properly human subjects. I needed help to change that way of thinking. My article on artistic collections with dogs made a strong case for the mutual relevance of leading-edge aesthetic theories and human-animal studies, but its publication in the Representation of Animals, a special issue of the journal Society of Animals, was pure magic. For it was both a crucial step in establishing scholarly credibility for this kind of research and a gateway for my own long-term collaborations with each and every one of the contributors, as well as the guest editor to that special issue, that very special issue. Along the way of my career, ASI has provided me with even more opportunities to make my mark. When I served in many supporting roles for the ASI Summer Institute, I think it's the increasing responsibilities that I've taken on for the journal Society and Animals over the past few decades that really indicate to me how valuable this institution is. Whether as a peer review editor, a book review contributor, eventually associate editor for literature, then the managing editor for the humanities, and now as editor-in-chief of Society and Animals. All of these steps along the ladder of success definitely helped me personally. Sure, they gave me the credentials needed to become a full professor tenured at my university. But more importantly, they gave me the trust and belief that needed to be nurtured to really be a major contributor and as well as an advocate for human animal studies research. At every step of the way, Ken Shapiro has supported me, like so many others, in keeping Society and Animals at the leading edge of human animal studies research. Sure, Ken, you're here, so I can just say directly to you, you're a hardworking, whip-smart, visionary thinker. But equally important, and I think I want everyone to just pause for a minute and recognize this, equally important to Ken's success is his constantly demonstrating how very necessary generosity, humility, humor, if you know Ken, he's a very funny guy, and friendship have been to advancing the global struggle to enrich academic knowledges, skills, and networks necessary to promote understanding and meaningful advocacy across species divides. I can never thank you and congratulate you enough, dear ASI founders, donors, staff, other supporters, and friends. And most of all, Ken Shapiro himself. Here's to the next 40 years, right? Yay! Okay, so enough of that. I need to switch now to my MC role, which I'm so honored and so delighted to be performing here for you today. I will introduce each of our speakers and we'll hold questions, as Liz mentioned at the start, until after both of our speakers have spoken. Meanwhile, feel free to post questions and comments in the chat. So our first speaker and longtime friend of mine, Erica Fudge, is Professor of English at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in Scotland. For 25 years, her trailblazing research has mapped the various crossroads of human animal studies and Renaissance studies, and includes 5 monographs, 4 edited collections, plus dozens more essays. Most recently, she's the author of Quick Cattle and Dying Wishes, People and Their Animals in Early Modern England, published in 2018 by Cornell University Press, which draws from the broad and deep archival expertise that informs her additional studies of early modern meat eating, dreams, children, laughter, reason, bladder control, and animal faces. Her published work on contemporary culture looks at a range of areas where humans interact with animals, including pet ownership, experimentation, the wearing of fur, anthropomorphic children's literature, and vegetarianism. Many of you will appreciate also that from 2007 until last month, she served as the director of the British Animal Studies Network, hosting annual events in human animal studies devoted to growing conversations among scholars and other experts. Personally, I've learned so much from her contributions, not least through her longtime service on the editorial board of Society and Animals, and again, our decades-long friendship traveling the world. I ask you please to join me in welcoming Erica to today's celebration. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That's an incredibly generous introduction. I am now, I hope, sharing my screen. Can you all see a PowerPoint presentation there? That's great. Okay. I will kick on. First of all, I want to thank ASI for inviting me to give this talk as part of the anniversary celebrations. I am extremely honoured and humbled to have been invited, but I'm also absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to talk about them, the vital role ASI has played in the development of positive changes for non-human animals, in the development of human animal studies as an academic field, but also to just get a little bit egocentric in helping me to find my way through. Gala and Susan have already talked about this. Some of you may recognize a deliberate hint at Monty Python in my talk's title, where they had, in the life of Brian, what have animals ever done for history is deliberately invoking their all right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? I'm deliberately turning around the perhaps more expected what can history do for animals question, because I think that what has happened in the last 40 years since ASI came into being, and in no small part because of it, we can now also think not only about what academic disciplines can do to address pressing issues around surrounding our use and exploitation of animals, but also what bringing animals into academic focus, herding the sheep in front of the historians, if you like, might add to those disciplines. I'm going to start here with the perhaps more obvious question of what academic work might, we hope, do for animals, but then also turn to think about what animals might do for scholarship, because we should not forget how much scholarship has benefited from the animal term. So the work that animal studies has done for the work that many academics have done from different fields of the arts, humanities, social sciences, and what they can do to address and engage with human animals and human-animal relations is, in a sense, something we can trace, obviously, through the pages of Society and Animals. In it, we encounter studies of representation coming from different disciplines that ask us to think about animals in their reality, in their symbolic representation, and in new ways. Whether that is through studies on, these are just things I remembered off the top of my head, cat shelters, house rabbits, presidential dogs, the concept of anthropomorphism, and so many others. By doing this work, these essays open up to new scrutiny aspects of human-animal relations that have perhaps gone unstudied, or been assumed to be known and so not worth delving into. The essays have therefore refocused our vision, made us look again, and it's that is crucial. For me, coming from literary and historical perspectives, I often go back to Viktor Shklovsky, the early 20th century Russian critic's ideas about defamiliarization, to think about what scholarship should do in the world. His ideas prompt us to remember that the ways we live are ways that are inattentive, and that art has a way of doing something about that. And I include scholarship as part of what he's talking about. So Shklovsky said this in 1917, "A dance is a walk that is felt. Even more accurately, it is a walk which is constructed to be felt." I am suggesting that dancing is to walking what close scholarly engagement is to inattentive living. It should ask us to feel what living is like in a fresh way. Shklovsky also said this: what we call art, and as I said, I'm taking scholarship to be part of that, exists in order to give back the sensation of life, in order to make us feel things, in order to make us stony. The goal of art is to create the sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing things. The method of art is making strange. Making strange, also known as defamiliarization, is something that I think many of us in human animal studies have been doing for a long time. What has been taken for granted, the vital presence of animals in human lives, has long been deadened in academic study. Animals are metaphors. They are things to think with. They are meat, horsepower, and so on. What scholars working in human animal studies have done is bring the sensation back into the world of human animal relations. That can be quite literally the studies that have offered evidence of animal sentience and the capacity to experience pain, for example. But the concept of sensation that I want to focus on here is in relation to the shock of remembering, or perhaps better put, the shock of having realized you'd never even thought of that before. So how has history defamiliarized human-animal relations? I'm going to start with a personal anecdote. When I first went to the fabulous Essex Record Office in Chelmsford to read documents that I was going to use as my key data for Quick Cattle and Dying Wishes, the curators and staff were rather bemused that I'd be looking for cows in the archive. They thought it was odd, but within a couple of days they were beginning to say things like, "I suppose the animals really were important back then." I had, if you like, begun the work of defamiliarization just by telling them I was looking at wills to find the livestock. And I couldn't use the word livestock in the book because, just so you know, and this is me with my historical head on, the word livestock didn't come into contemporary usage until 1687. Quick cattle was the best equivalent I could find in the period. So I was making the stone of the expected past stony by asking the archivists to recognize that animals were part of the world of the documents that they were looking after. So what does this new approach produce? What is the value for thinking about human-animal relationships now of studying the past? I remember Sandra Swart, whose work I encountered for the first time when I was associate editor of the humanities section of Society and Animals for a few years at the beginning of the millennium. I remember her talking brilliantly at the Minding Animals conference in Delhi in 2015 about how learning from the past teaches us that the present is not fixed, that it shows how the present is based on a series of choices, and that the future is not inevitable or given, but can also become to be based on other choices that can be made. This is not, of course, easy. Karl Marx reminded us that, quote, men, make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances or existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. We have agency, but there are also limits. And as such, we might note, we are not so different from the animals. Understanding the past and attending to the traditions that weigh like nightmares on our brains allows us to not only understand that past, the thing that we might say is over there, fenced off, moved away from. It asks us to recognize the importance of taking on, comprehending that past, to frame how we move forward. I think the bringing together of the past and the present in the pages of Society and Animals, in the work of young scholars who've met at the ASI Summer Institutes over the years, reinforces the potential for historical work to be part of our understanding of the present and of the future. As someone whose work focuses on that past, this is vitally important, and it also allows historians of course, to encounter work from very different disciplines with different foci. That in itself is crucial. But there are other ways of thinking about the past which are perhaps less nightmarish and take in a more positive, imaginative turn. I teach a class to second-year undergraduates on the BA Humanities at the University of Strathclyde called Making the Modern Human. And on that class, I call such acts of the imagination the exercise of peppercorn logic. I'll explain what I mean by that spicy conception in order to return to the animals and show how it might work in animal studies. So on this class, I give my students some extracts of work about humoral medicine. That is the medical system that was the mainstream understanding of human and animal health from the classical period via Galen and through the Middle Ages into the 17th century. This conception of health was founded on an idea of the body that was made up of 4 humours, black bile, so 4 elements, liquids, black bile, phlegm, blood, and choler. And these in turn reflected the elemental makeup of the individual body of each human and animal, as well as the universe. So we've got dry, wet, cool, and hot as our elemental makeup. These in turn produce humours, the melancholic, the phlegmatic, that is the calm, the sanguine, which is the optimistic, and the choleric, the person who's quick to anger. And the ideal of health in this system of medicine was to achieve and maintain a balance of humours. And ill health was felt to come about because one humour was too dominant. So you might bleed someone to get rid of what was regarded as abundant blood. You might give someone a purge to get rid of their superfluous bile. And here you can see in the 2 black and white woodcuts images of leeches at the top and someone being bled. And in the middle, we've got someone vomiting. It looks like they've got long hair. I'm sorry, it's puke. It's medieval puke. You might also address your diet. So I've done tests. I know I'm a sanguine person. I'm pretty optimistic. And what I know from that is I should avoid eating peacock. That's important to know. I'm also pleased to say that I do eat the right things because I like pickles, and that is melancholic food. And therefore it tempers my sanguine by making me a bit more melancholy. So every pickled onion I eat is health-giving, I tell myself. So where's the peppercorn fits into all this? In his 2018 book, Medieval Bodies, Life, Death and Art in the Middle Ages, Jack Hartnell writes about one medieval medical text that suggests the insertion of peppercorns into the vagina after intercourse as a contraceptive. Don't try this at home, everybody. I'm not in any way medically trained. Hartnell acknowledges that such surviving medical sources seem, he says, weirdly comical in their wrong-headedness. And this is undoubtedly the case. But what I ask my students to do is to move beyond that. In fact, I'm quite strict. I tell them that to simply dismiss this contraception with the idea that they must have been mad back then is to make all sorts of assumptions. It's to assume, for example, that we in our ways of thinking are not in any way mad. I remind them about the dangers of antibiotics and how we keep overusing them and the damage that is doing. So to regard the cure of this contraception as funny, our evidence of past stupidity is to relegate it to a place of utterly different world from us. It is to separate ourselves from it. As such, this world has no value beyond the comic and is so not needed in our understanding of ourselves. I tell my students this is the least interesting thing they can do with this strange fact. The next step for us to do is to wonder, why would they think that? Or what is the logic to this contraception, hence the idea of peppercorn logic? We work it out. Peppercorns within the system of the 4 humours are hot and dry. Yes, everybody sees that. So it makes sense then for them to be viewed as possessing contraceptive qualities if we assume conception was believed to be most likely if the woman's reproductive organs were cool and moist. So inserting a peppercorn into the vagina counters the coolness and moistness that might encourage fertility. This is peppercorn logic. You take the system that sounds ridiculous seriously and you try to understand it on its own terms. The final step I suggest to my students is to wonder what it would be like to think like that. What kind of embodied experience would living be in the world? What might urinating mean? A runny nose, a fart, a bad knee? This is the work of defamiliarization. We're beginning to look at ourselves through different lenses. Another question that logically follows from this is, what do we do now that is our version of peppercorn logic? What apparently unremarkable and unremarked assumptions that we make that would be unremarkable and strange, not just to the past, but to cultures other than our own. Let's think about that. On another class I teach to master's students called Fleshy Histories, we apply peppercorn logic to thinking about meat eating and meat avoidance. Why, we wonder, is it easier for many people to think about eating a sentient animal than to think about eating a lab-cultured burger made out of their own skin cells? I thank Josh Milburn for that query. Why, in 2013, when there was a scandal about horse meat entering into supermarket lasagnas, was it so repulsive to people who would quite happily eat cows? Hint, the discomfort was not about the phenylbutazone that the horses might have been injected with before they were put in the lasagna. There's something weird going on there. So this is where we can return to think about human-animal relations. If understanding and interrogating the past can allow us a way of thinking differently about the present and so the future, if it can make the stone stony again, then it's possible that understanding human-animal relations in the past might at least unsettle our assumptions today. So when I was thinking about women's relationship with the dairy cows in the yards of early 17th century Essex, for example, I was bringing back into focus something that had been swept into the margins. In agricultural history, there's been a tendency to think about animals in terms of their productivity, how much milk, how many calves, and how big, and so on. What I was trying to do was thinking about the human-cow relationship as a very particular kind of encounter, one with economic importance, absolutely, but also as the evidence allowed me to show that it was one of effective power. I may not have answered the research question that led the project in the first place, and that question was, what was it like to be a cow in early modern England? But asking that question had opened up a strange route through orthodox materials like agricultural manuals, wills, and diaries, the stuff of which orthodox and human-focused history had been made for generations. What I argued was that these people relied on their cows because of the nutritious milk they provided and because of the calves they produced that could be sold on to increase their household income. And as such, these were valuable animals, and therefore looking after them was an important part of their owners' day-to-day lives. So there's a financial aspect here. It's an obvious move from there to then argue that if we are interested in the lives of the people, we should be paying attention to what they were themselves paying attention to. Their quick cattle were a cornerstone of their lives, and to not look at them, to not think through the animals, would be not doing historical work as fully as it might be done. In fact, it would be applying our modern peppercorn logic to their worlds in ways that assume that our logic is true and timeless. It would read animals through a lens that views them as objects, that sees cows as milk-producing fleshy machines. That might be how the animal industrial complex posits the non-human creatures that are its fodder. I don't think that's how the housewives of early 17th century Essex saw their cows, whose flanks they leant against twice a day, perhaps, as this document says, this text says, for 15 years. So one cow you've got your relationship with for 15 years. This is what animals have done for history. Attending to their presence, as perhaps the early modern women did, has defamiliarized assumptions that have held sway for generations of historians. And from that we are changing what might be considered historical and are asking people to think differently about the past and so the present, and we hope the future. Now, in an article in Society and Animals from 2020, Ken Shapiro outlined how the flourishing work in animal studies has led to a sea change. And just tiny script there you won't be able to read is the different publications that have emerged, the disciplines that are being impacted by this field. It's a kind of extraordinary bringing together of this kind of material. Where thinking about human-animal relations was perhaps once regarded as hobby academia, not proper scholarship, or as evidence of sentimentality, a sign of the writer's innate, usually gendered, unscholarliness, or as a reflection of the writer's activism wrongly applied to what had been purely an objective pursuit, that absolutely you don't bring yourself to scholarship. Human animal studies in its wide range of disciplinary manifestations, animal history, animal literary studies, modern human geography, to just name three, is now more and more recognized as a vital part of academic discourse. Not only is it attending to what there is in our data, if only we look carefully, it's also reflecting on the fact that we are in a climate crisis. And so with the very real possibility of multiple annihilations hanging over us, we need to think differently in order to plan differently. Human animal studies allows another vision of living in this world that recognizes the absolute inseparability of humans from other species. And history reflects that. It's interesting to note that back in 2012, I was invited alongside a load of other fantastic scholars to participate in a symposium organized by the journal History and Theory. In its first instantiation, when we were invited, this symposium was titled, Do Animals Need a History? When the journal special issue came out a year later, it was titled, Does History Need Animals? I suggest that the fact that there was that shift in focus in the question being asked showed that something had happened. And I would strongly suggest that ASI had a massive role to play in that shift. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you to ASI.
Thank you so much, Erica. I think I'm not the only one whose mind is just swirling in wonderful new directions right now. Thank you so much for your thoughtful talk. Again, we're holding discussion until the end, and you are very welcome to post your questions and your comments into the chat, and we'll get to those right away. Our next speaker, Zane McNeill, is a non-binary activist scholar and a longtime vegan from West Virginia. They've published 6 edited collections on a wide range of topics that include building multi-species resistance against exploitation, queering Appalachian ecologies, and pursuing politics as public art. I know Zane's work best from their groundbreaking volume, Vegan Entanglements, Dismantling Racial and Carceral Capitalism, published in 2022 by Lantern. But Zane has done a wonderful lot of other stuff, and these achievements include, but aren't limited to, working at Farm Sanctuary, the Humane League, the Humane Society of the United States, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and the Animal Legal Defense Fund. From 2021 to 22, Zane volunteered as Director of Publications at the Institute of Critical Animal Studies and was the recipient of the 2022 National Lawyers Guild's Legal Worker Award for their labor and animal rights organizing. Presently, Zane is a student at the University of Denver's Sturm College of Law and serves as the National Lawyer Guild's Animal Liberation Committee Chair. I ask you please to join me in welcoming Zane to today's celebration. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Susan, and thank you for everyone here. Susan said, my name is Zane McNeill, and I've been vegan for half of my life, probably a little more than that now. My talk is really thinking through not just our academic work and what it can do to bring in animal voices and experiences in our relationships with them, but then also on the other side, thinking about how our scholarship can inform our advocacy and activism, specifically in the United States. I've worked in almost every big name animal rights group and have published 2 edited collections on the entanglements of speciesism and other systemic oppressions, including racial and carceral capitalism, labor issues, and cis heteropatriarchy. Today, I'm asking human animal scholars to critically examine how these structural hierarchies might show up in your work, whether explicitly or implicitly, in what you decide to address or not address or think about. And what do you think just about how these biases and the ways we're socialized to thinking about animals and our relationships with them may not always be interrogated. I want to thank the Animals and Societies Institute for inviting me to talk about these difficult issues, and hope we can start a conversation really thinking about how carceral logics operate in our spaces and why jailing people does not liberate animals. So when we think of the relationship between humans and animals, we cannot ignore industrialized agriculture, how we cage, forcefully reproduce, kill, and consume billions of animals a year, and how the sector exploits the marginalized people who work in it. One thing that I really appreciate about the human animal studies space is that, like people mentioned before, it really creates a lot of entry points, a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different interests, and a lot of different kinds of people around the world to think about our relationships with animals. I think there has been a lot of work critically examining industrialized agriculture, but maybe not so much in this space. And so I'm excited to kind of endeavor into it, not just thinking about how it affects animals, but also the people who work in the space as well. So new data from the US Department of Agriculture's 2022 census shows that 1.7 billion animals are currently being raised in the US factory farms every year. This is a 6% increase from 2016 and nearly a 50% increase from 20 years ago. Factory farms, which employ more than 700,000 workers in the United States, are in healthy and stressful places for work. Slaughterhouses and meatpacking workers are chronically underpaid. Salaries average about $28,450, which is just above the federal poverty line for a family of 4, despite these jobs being some of the most dangerous professions. Employees are regularly denied bathroom breaks and threatened with deportation when they voice concerns, and often faced emotional abuse and humiliation from managers. Workers in the sector are predominantly Black and Latinx, with a large percentage of immigrants and refugees. Only about 25% of these employees reside in households where all members aged 14 or above possess basic English proficiency, and workers' immigration status, this proficiency level, and economic precarity make these workers extremely exploitable. Past investigations into meatpacking plants have underscored how companies consistently prioritize profits over the safety and public health of workers. Increasing line speeds in which workers are pressured to kill more animals in less time, which Chelsea Wonders has done a lot of work on, long hours and repetitive motions significantly increase the risk of injury. As a result, workers are often experience chronic pain in their hands, wrists and arms, shoulders, and back. Under the intense pace at which most facilities operate, repetitive stress injuries become inevitable, according to the Food Empowerment Project. In fact, according to the Food Chain Workers Alliance, 65% of meatpacking and food processing workers have experienced job-related injuries. And additionally, data reported by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, in 2015 indicated that amputations and hospitalizations are common at Tyson Food meatpacking plants, though the Food Empowerment Project says that the rate of workplace injuries may be much higher because of a culture of underreporting. So in addition to harming workers' physical health, working on factory farms also negatively impacts workers' mental health and the communities that they are in. Workers in slaughterhouses frequently experience shock, trauma, paranoia, fear, guilt, anxiety, and shame, which is often accompanied by recurring nightmares. Coping mechanisms employed by workers include disassociating from their tasks, suppressing emotions, devaluing animals, and resorting to alcohol and drug abuse. The psychological distress from slaughterhouse labor extends beyond individual suffering, contributing to broader social issues such as increased crime rates, antisocial behavior, and incidences of sexual offenses. So in a lot of my work, I think about the roots of industrialized agriculture and how it's reified in all of our structures. And I contend that the exploitation we see of workers and animals at factory farms and slaughterhouses is deeply entangled with colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism. And so I use the concepts of racial and carceral capitalism as tools to consider how these systems not only make non-human animals, quote unquote, slaughterable, but also dehumanize and animalize the workers who raise, kill, and dismember them. So racial capitalism is a term coined by Cedric Robinson and posits that racialized exploitation and capital accumulation are mutually reinforcing systems. Scholars like Jackie Wang have asserted that racial capitalism is deeply entangled with carceral systems, which are shaped by and work in tandem with the imperatives of global capitalism. In this context, a carceral and racial capitalism framework allows us to consider how these systems transforms human and non-human bodies into commodities whose labor is consumed and capitalized upon by an elite class. Consequently, this analysis asserts a shared exploitation between laborers, both human and non-human, which is designed within a perpetuated bias system built on carceral and racial capitalism. So I feel like that's a lot of just like theory jargon. And so I like to really try to saturate it in real world events. And I think this example that occurred in April 2020 during the height of the pandemic really illustrates what this is on the ground. So in April 2020, managers at Tyson Foods organized a quote, winner take all betting poll, wagering on how many employees at a meatpacking plant in Waterloo, Iowa would contract COVID-19. As the virus devastated the meatpacking industry that month, Tyson officials chose to keep the Waterloo plant operational and provided incentives for employees to work regardless of their health, ignored signs of illness, and implemented inadequate social distancing measures and protections. This led to an outbreak infecting nearly 1,000 workers and resulting in 6 deaths. So this is an example of how necropolitics operate in the sector. Necropolitics refers to politics, so social and political power, to determine who lives, who dies, and how someone should live or die. In their article, Zombification, Social Death in Slaughterhouses, U.S. Industrial Practices of Livestock Slaughter, Merrick Muller, one of my favorite scholars, described necropolitics as the state's ability to render certain bodies killable. And they use the example of our history of designating enslaved people as chattel to strip them of their personhood and legal rights to life and liberty. Muller uses this term zombification to express the social processes in which one becomes socially dead, physically, psychologically, and culturally. This concept is used to explore how non-human animal agriculture not only places animals in the role of the ideally socially dead subject, the chattel slave, but also animalizes and dehumanizes the human workers. Quote, slaughterhouse subjects, human and animal, exist in uncomfortably close proximity to one another, thus contaminating each other with the particularities of their liminalities and further reifying a colonial sliding scale of humanity. In other words, under racial carceral capitalism, necropolitics refers not only to non-human animals as slaughterable, but also renders the humans as animalized and dehumanized to make them more easy to exploit. As Muller explains, embedded deeply within this necropolitical, racial, and carceral capitalist system is speciesism, the assumption that individuals are deemed fully or solidly human are superior to other humans, both human and non-human, who are deemed animals. Speciesism is inherently hierarchical and simultaneously justifies the exploitation of non-human animals and animalized humans, rendering their suffering relatively invisible and unquestioned. Industrial agriculture relies on this entanglement of speciesism with white supremacy and racial capitalism, which itself depends on a hierarchized relationship between race, animality, and humanity. And so I want to bring in a few of my favorite scholars to kind of further contextualize this. One of, I think, the seminal scholars who was also published with Lantern, I think Martin's here, who was my editor then, so appreciate your being here. So Silko, in their book, Aphorism, Essays on Pop Culture, Feminism, and Black Veganism from Two Sisters, which if you haven't read it, you really should, explores how humanist is, quote, a certain way of being, especially exemplified by how one looks or behaves, what practices are associated with one's community, and so on. This means that the conceptions of humanity and human and animality and animal have been constructed along racial lines. Similarly, racism's quote unquote ontological plasticity, as posited by Zakiya Jackson in Becoming Human, Matter, and Meaning in an Anti-Black World, quote, renders one's humanity provisional, in which, quote, Blackened people are not so much as dehumanized as non-humans or cast out as liminal humans, nor are Blackened people framed as animal-like or machine-like, but are cast as sub, supra, and human simultaneously in a manner that puts them being in peril. In other words, white supremacy constructs and relies on a social malleability of racialized people and its entanglement with surveillance, control, and carcerality to extract capital from its laborers. In this racist capitalist landscape, meatpacking workers experience this ontological plasticity by being simultaneously human and non-human, human as legal employees of a company and non-human as being able to be killable commodities, right? As we saw in the winner takes all poll, where the workers' lives obviously didn't matter. Yet instead of targeting the roots of this harm, capitalism, white supremacy, and the racialized labor and dehumanization of slaughterhouse workers, some animal rights organizations have instead focused on punitive justice measures against these workers instead of trying to trouble and disrupt these structural systems or even go after the factory farm companies themselves. And so this is where a lot of my work kind of delves into, is thinking about, all right, so if this is a theory, what can we do in our actual work in organizations, in our research organizations, in our personal advocacy to try to inform the way we advocate for non-human animals? And so the animal advocacy movement, I argue, has a history of relying on carceral veganism, which one of my favorite people in the world, Riley Claire Valentine, defines as, quote, a form of veganism which uses the state to protect animals through forms of violence, in which workers at meatpacking plants were at high risk of both infection of COVID-19 and imprisonment, as well as potential deportation. Similarly, Haley Huguet in Current Affairs had criticized the animal advocacy movement as implementing carceral vegan tactics to, quote, treat workers in animal agriculture as scapegoats, end quote. Unfortunately, there's a long history of groups pushing for harsh sentencing for animal cruelty offenders. In Beyond Cages, Justin Marceau contends that many animal welfare groups, most notably ASPCA and the Animal Legal Defense Fund, ALDF, have conflated felony sentences with animal liberation. The most notable cases in which such conflation occurred, I would argue, would be the prosecution of Brian Douglas after Mercy for Animals' undercover footage of animal cruelty at a North Carolina butterball factory in 2012, the lawsuit Humane Society of the United States versus Hallmark Meatpacking Company in 2013 that led to the conviction of Daniel Navarra and Rafael Sanchez Herrera, and the arrest and subsequent ICE custody of Edgar Gardonzo Vasquez after the Animal Recovery Mission's undercover footage of Fair Oaks Farms in 2019. And so I think we can all agree, right, that industrial agriculture itself is a normalized structure of violence. We consume animals every day. These animals are usually kept in really small cages in the US, though that's changing a little bit, are forcibly reproduced and cut and killed at a small amount of their life, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And so whenever we see incidences of animal abuse on factory farms, such as the kicking or other harm towards non-human animals, it can be very visually troubling for us. But then it can also kind of eclipse the structural violence that is happening at all points in time. And so going after these individuals who harm animals, who themselves are in a structure of harm, does not actually change the underlying structures that cause this harm or the industrial agriculture normalized violence itself. And so the reliance on undercover investigations has been critiqued by Huguet as, quote, offering a striking example of some of the movement's more harmful tendencies to treat workers in animal agriculture as scapegoats. And Elise Winter, in one of my collections, Building Multi-Species Resistance Against Exploitation, as utilizing a surveillance and detention framework that often targets marginalized farm and slaughterhouse workers. So Brian Douglas might have been the first person in the US to be convicted of an animal cruelty towards factory farm birds, which is considered a huge milestone in the vegan movement. However, the slaughter of the birds who are not protected under the Animal Welfare Act will continue as a normal practice, and butterball management and executives would continue to get off scot-free. And so this pattern in which workers who sit at these axes of multiple marginalizations are scapegoated, while factory farm management and the system as a whole remains unscathed, is apparent in each of these cases. In his memoir, Indefensible Adventures of a Farm Animal Protection Lawyer, Peter Brandt, who worked on this case, described feeling guilt about Navarro and Sanchez Herrera's criminal convictions. While Hallmark, quote, never recovered from the meat recall and the USDA shutdown and the scandal that started it all, operations like Hallmark persist. Similarly, only one person from the Fair Oaks case was arrested, an undocumented worker who was also deported. Huguet explains this phenomenon as such. Firings and arrests make for better media coverage. Better media coverage shines more light on the situation of animals. More light may convince greater numbers to go vegan. But in the struggle for animal liberation, it is unfortunate but inevitable that human workers must pay the part of a scapegoat. And that's what the main theory, it looks like, is in the movement. But as we see from the ever increasing amount of human consumption of non-human animals, this isn't working. So animal organizations' perspective that harming workers is unfortunate but inevitable is not only extremely inaccurate, but inherently violent. I think this is more insidious than just the fault of single issue advocacy, but really an issue with who the movement caters to, who funds it, and who organizes the strategic principles behind it, which has been really critiqued as sort of white veganism, and the movement as being entangled with white carceral capitalism and white supremacy. And so many organizations seem to think that assimilating into and utilizing the tools of carceral state is progress, affording these groups a sort of respectability and authority. However, I argue that it only progresses insofar as it perpetuates continued exploitation and disposability of marginalized communities by the white supremacist state. So in addition to, quote, replicating relationships of silent violence and bad care, end quote in Claire's words, these tactics have proved fruitless in reducing the harm experienced by non-human animals in the industrial agricultural system. Not only do they harm those being targeted, but have allowed the meat companies to blame a couple of quote unquote bad apples and avoid being held accountable for the systemic harm to animals, workers, and the environment. Kelly Shanahan explains this as the effect of animal protection movement's sole focus on animal abuse and resulting desire for individual carceral punishment compounds the abuses that workers suffer in the meatpacking industry. By being set on punishing meatpacking workers for animal abuse, animal protection groups miss the opportunity to attack the predatory practices of the meatpacking industry that contribute to the abuse in the first place. So the animal advocacy movement, I argue, stands at a pivotal juncture. Meat consumption is at its all-time high, and the movement has alienated varied communities by a history of championing the rights of non-human animals by overlooking the needs of the most marginalized human populations. This has resulted at times in the focus on alleviating the suffering of animals at the expense of marginalized communities, and in others with collaborating with the carceral system to the detriment of vulnerable meat industry workers. However, Huget offers a roadmap for the animal advocacy movement to build solidarity between the animal advocacy and labor movements and transform non-human animal liberation from a single cause issue into a mass movement. Huget recommends that the animal advocacy movement ends its reliance on carceral tactics and create more entry for people to join the movement by pursuing tactics that use worker power, community power, and citizen power. This can look like rallying voters behind bills such as a Farm System Reform Act, which we do see some organizations doing, or like organizing within workplaces and communities affected by the meat industry to pave the way for actions such as strikes and boycotts. This alternative approach to non-human animal liberation not only offers us more avenues to engage with the system and the movement, but also prompts us to establish tangible links with other movements advocating for institutional abolition, such as those aimed at police and prison abolition, the dismantling of ICE, and other sort of movements. While the animal advocacy movement has been hesitant to move from a single issue advocacy approach to align with non-human animal liberation, Will Bousseau points to the labor rights organization Venceremos, which organized the first strike of poultry workers in Arkansas. Magali Licoli, the co-founder of the group, told Bousseau that, quote, "the struggle should be unified," end quote. Bousseau also points to campaigns by animal advocacy groups such as the Animal Legal Defense Fund's July 2020 whistleblower campaign and Food and Water Watch's Federal Trade Commission complaint regarding worker safety concerns at Tyson. Quote, "solidarity campaigns bring together workers and animals' rights will not be easy to build. But examples like this show that not only it's possible, but increasingly necessary. By building power with labor rights organizations like Venceremos and other labor rights groups, the animal advocacy movement has a much better chance to achieve its mission of animal liberation." So these are the struggles that I hope the Human Animal Studies field will endeavor to confront. And Animal and Society Institute is doing just that. While I'm an adamant believer in the abolition of the criminal legal system, from police and prosecutors to ICE, there may be more incremental ways for both the academic and advocacy space to work to disrupt racial and carceral capitalism in our work. So as was mentioned earlier, Animal Society Institute has a history of doing this through their programs like Any-Care and BARC, which stands for Behavior, Accountability, Responsibility, and Knowledge, which are diversion, education, and intervention programs. These programs can replace jail times for those convicted of animal abuse and provide cognitive, behavioral, and psychodynamic family systems and attachment theory therapies to those who abused animals. Many people who have abused animals have themselves been abused and are deserving of trauma informed practices that respect their autonomy and keep them out of cages. These interventions not only help people who've abused animals stay out of a cage, but also help them build healthier, more compassionate relationships with humans and non-humans. Restorative justice approaches like these, which focus on respect, responsibility, repair, and reintegration, are one way to disrupt our existing approaches, which want to enact punishment and harm on others who themselves have been harmed. So thank you so much, Animal Society Institute, for having me. Thanks for everyone who's here. And I hope you consider how these systems may have informed your work in different ways so we can try to really build a liberatory praxis moving forward in our work.
Thank you, Zane, so much. As someone who's also US based and very inclined to get down about reading news headlines and seeing the systemic problems around us, you've given me personally a great sense of hope. And thank you so much for that talk and your work in general. So we do have time for questions, which is absolutely wonderful. Some have come through the chat already, so I just want to put them out there to see if our speakers want first and foremost to respond to each other or to some of these comments. They go from the very granular in particular to the wide-ranging and across both. So I'm happy to have you jump in wherever you feel like. So for instance, Erica, you've been asked if you can think of an example of how peppercorn logic applies to household pet keeping. Not to put you on the spot or anything. And Zane, people are asking about what you know of cultural attitudes towards animals the slaughterhouse workers are bringing to their work and to these problems more generally. I think too, also between your talks, I'm getting a strong sense of pushing back against the logic of marginalization by association, and some of these questions also are starting to ask you to say more please about how it is that whether it's historians or slaughterhouse workers, just being with animals and being brought together suddenly sets you up to be discredited automatically or somehow lesser from the view of power, particularly within a colonialist and capitalist dominating framework. Yeah, so where would you like to start? I open it out to both of you.
Shall I kick off? Yeah, shall I kick off? Thank you. I mean, Zane, that was fantastic. That was such an interesting talk. And it did make me think, in a sense, what you're doing is, I'm not just obsessed by this idea of defamiliarizing, but you are kind of asking us to look again at the logics of animal welfare and animal rights and so on and so forth. And I think that's a hugely important thing on the basis of what you're talking about, the carceral logic, but also just as the way it shines a new light on the larger problem. I think, to go to the question about the peppercorn logic with pet keeping, I will always go back to the work of Julianne Smith, and I know one of her essays was in Society and Animals. Back in the, I think, mid-2000s, Julianne wrote a couple of fantastic essays about house rabbits and how she kept house rabbits and transformed her house to fit the rabbits rather than making the rabbits be trained to fit her house. And it's a really, really interesting application of the logic of, if I believe these animals should live in my home and be members of my family, I can't put them in a cage. And therefore, this is what comes from that. And I teach it on that basis because I just think it's about applying logic, that the people who are going, oh, I could never do that, are being illogical. That is where the problem lies, that you'll have one form of logic which says I don't eat this animal, but the other form of logic that says I can keep it in a cage. And so I guess that would be one way of thinking about how the idea of the peppercorn logic could apply to pet keeping. On the issue of being with animals, I personally think there's been a massive change in the academic culture surrounding animal studies and human animal studies. I was doing my PhD in the early 90s. So I kind of, when I was finding out the dates of ASI, of Animals and Society, Society and Animals, I realized that that was almost exactly the same time as I was starting my PhD, which was kind of nice. I think at that point, I do remember I was writing about bear baiting in early modern England, and someone came up to me who was doing a much flashier kind of modern PhD, obviously, and said, it's so nice people can still write PhDs like that, as if I was some kind of mad antiquarian. That has completely changed now. And so I guess the attachment of sentimentality, of course it will still exist. Of course there will be the people who are defending old versions of academia. They're defending the anthropocentrism in the same way that there will be people who don't want to think about the status of the workers in the, the abattoirs and so on, because that just kind of makes it more complicated. But my absolute honest answer to that is things have changed to the extent that I feel kind of almost fashionable. I don't want to go too far because I'm old, but I, came late, but it's quite nice. So anyway, that's my responses to them. And on the question, I think Abel Alves asked the question about colonial examples. I have The Tame and the Wild sitting here. I'm about to read it to write a review of it. So that's why it's just sitting there. For my period, one of the fantastic things that the movement to the so-called New World did for European culture was that it really upset things. There are no marsupials in the Bible. And on that basis, things get a bit more complicated than they used to be. So it's that kind of point on one level. Of course, there are so many other levels to think about, that it really forces the European culture, which has seen itself as true, dominant, and so on, to recognize there might be a problem with it. And I think that is so interesting for thinking about human-animal relations. And I'm not the first person to talk about that, but I think that's, for me, one of the interesting things. I think Virginia John Anderson's brilliant book, Creatures of Empire, which looks at the way cows became a kind of, or livestock animals became a kind of pivot between the English settlers in Virginia and the native peoples there as a way of negotiating relations, I think, for me, remains the book I wish I'd written. I don't think I could have ever written it because I'm not that clever, but it is just a brilliant book that is about cultural clash. I'll stop talking.
Thank you, Erica. Zane, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Erica. I loved your talk. My background is actually, my BA was in history, and I was doing a lot of intellectual history work. And then my master's was in political science, but really coming from a queer theory perspective. And so I really like this idea of making strange and defamiliarizing, because so much of that deconstruction work is really integral in the queer space. And a lot of my work, whether or not I actually cite to Foucault and things, right, is on this idea of thinking through systems of power in a really deconstructionist way of making strange and thinking through deviance. I think that's very helpful when we think through human animal studies and just the way humans have engaged with and think about animals as both a construction that we use in a metaphor in our work, like we've talked about in building society and hierarchies, but also just an actual way of what constructing the animal even is. And, I was thinking about the idea of when you talk about shock, of realizing you've never thought of something before, right? And I remember Melanie Joy's work on carnism, this idea, that we're really socialized and born into this belief system that animals are consumable. And what is consumable? Like you were talking about horse meat. And in the US, right, when there was the horse meat scandal, people were so angry about it. But then what is socialized in food and what is socialized as friends? And one of her talks, Joy, had an image of like spaghetti and meatballs, right? And it's like, oh, it smells so good, it tastes so amazing, but then you realize it's like a golden retriever meatball, right? And like that vitriolic response people have to that, and what is that boundary, right, between disgust and wanting to consume something, which I think is really interesting. When we think through like history, I think, and whose history is taught and what history, who tells the history, right? I think it's really interesting around non-human animals, because it's obviously animals have a way of constructing their own histories and voicing their needs, right? I think like Will Kamilka's work is really helpful with that. And then Sarah Collings, right? The idea of animals do resist, and there are instances, right, of them deciding based on where they are, what they want, and voicing that. It's so interesting with human animal studies work, because at some point there's this idea of wanting to be like the voice for the voiceless, right? Or wanting to not, or deconstruct anthropocentrism, but then also being the ones to write about our relationship with animals or animals' relationship with us, which I think is something I personally always struggle with, is how to bring in non-human voices without putting my voice into it. And that's something that I think I've learned a lot from other scholars in human animal studies about how to do it. Catherine Oliver is one of my favorites. She's a critical geographer who does a lot of work with chickens and thinking through chickens' relationships with us. And so I think also something I was thinking about with your talk was this idea of how the human and the animal as constructions and like this nature culture distinction was even created, right? Because you're looking at the work of human animal relationships in the medieval time, but then a lot of our understanding of what is human and animal came out of the Enlightenment time, right? And a lot of ecofeminist scholars, which is what I was raised with, really have deconstructed that. And that's, I think, also where the work of like Carol Adams has come in from, that like kind of second wave ecofeminist work on the connection between the forced reproduction of animals as well as the sexualization of humans and meat. And so I'm really interested to learn more, and I think I'm going to dig into this afterwards, of how this was constructed before the idea of the Enlightenment, because so much of my thought of these constructions come from like that time. I think also just something I was really interested in, and I think this is what human animal studies has really done a lot of work in, is think about how academic research shows up in these spaces, and then in also our work. And so for me, I come from like a very like critical, I want theory to inform praxis, but at the same time, from an academic perspective, I'm kind of privileged because I'm an independent scholar, right? And so I get to be sort of on the boundaries and disrupt things and then leave. But it is really difficult. I feel like when there's a history of wanting to regulate people who do this work to the margins, right? And I think, Susan, you mentioned this, that once you bring up animals, you're suddenly regulated. And I think because of the work of the Human Animal Studies Institute, that's gotten a lot better, right? This animal turn, there's so much more interest, but it is sometimes difficult for those who work within these, these academic institutions to be fully respected and for this work to be respected as research, right? And so despite me really coming from like an activist perspective, I just want to hold space and appreciate everyone here who's continued to dedicate their work to these important questions. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about before we move on, I think you had mentioned, Susan, there had been a question about animal work, people who work in slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants, what biases and constructions of animals they themselves bring in. And I would say that in some ways, it's actually more transformative than the work, than the way everyone thinks about it, right? We're all ingrained in the system of carnism. If you believe what Melanie Joy's work is doing and this idea of speciesism, one of my favorite sort of vignettes is from Timothy Packriat's book, Every 12 Seconds. He had gone undercover and worked in a meatpacking plant, and to try to understand, who was actually killing the animals, and then what people do with that knowledge, right? That heavy feeling of being responsible for death is really harmful for people. And so I think they shared it between like 4 different people. So whatever you considered death or dying was actually a shared responsibility. So no one felt that continually. But in that book and in his experience, they were off shift, they were eating outside, and one of the cows had gotten out and was running outside of the fence. And the workers were actually like cheering it on, right? Because the cow was being chased by the police, and I think ended up getting shot down, because that happens relatively often, right? The police will shoot down animals to get out of factory farms. But the workers in that moment were aligning themselves with this cow trying to run away from the police because they themselves felt a solidarity with this animal. And they themselves had also been sort of victims of this carceral state, of this over policing. And so they saw themselves in this cow trying to get out. And so I think that sort of show of resistance and people really seeing themselves in animals resisting when they themselves are under the same kind of structural oppression is a space where there's a lot of room for disrupting these normative ideas of what is animal, what is human, and what we bring into our work. So.
Thank you. Both of you in your comments have anticipated that many people in the chat are curious to hear more about these sources, these titles, these authors that you're talking about. So if you have the time, please add those to the chat for the benefit of others. I would just have to return to Zane's comment about learning where this notion of the human came from. Erica's book, Brutal Reasoning, just really opened my eyes. And it's because you did that granular archival research to blast our minds open about what we think is true in the early modern period and what people were actually writing and saying completely different things. And yeah, it takes work, it takes commitment to read. And similarly with Perpetuate doing that on the line interactive work with people who are doing slaughter, make people who make that commitment over time to hear what it is that the people who are closest to the animals had to think and had to say, that is really at the heart of human animal studies research and what separates it, I think, from advocacy. That said, we need advocates everywhere. And Ken knows that I constantly come back at him by saying that I am an advocate for advocates of human animal studies scholarship, because we need that support among each other. We need to be reading each other. We need to be, promoting each other at every move, like Erica so smoothly just did with Abel. And that book too. Thank you. I do have to turn us over back to Liz for the final comments, and I just want to encourage everyone to keep these conversations going. Please use this session, which will be recorded. It has been recorded and will be made available too in your teaching, in your talking, and moving forward. And reach out to me anytime Society and Animals seems interesting to you, because I'm happy to talk.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you again to Ken, Gala, and Erica and Zane for really moving and thought-provoking commentary and discussion. As a nonprofit, ASI is only able to continue this and our work in general through donations. For 40 years, you've stood by our side and supported us to showcase, as hope we've done today, the very latest in the HAS field. And it's only through your continued support that we can ensure that we're here for the next 40 years. So we ask you to please consider supporting our 40th anniversary campaign with a donation and help us raise $40,000 to develop our HAS programs over the coming year. If you're looking for even more inspiration, if this event wasn't quite enough, then please take a look at our 40 Reasons to Give to ASI page, the link for which is being shared in the chat right now. And again, to all of you, our donors, supporters, and friends, some of you coming today from as far as Mosul, Iraq, and South Australia, thank you so much for all you do and for celebrating ASI in the field of human animal studies with us today. Thank you so much.